South Sudan's negotiators are once again gathering in Ethiopia to try to solve the 18-month-old conflict dividing the world's youngest country. The warring factions only have 1 month left to form an internationally mandated power-sharing government. The agenda will pretty much be around outstanding issues like the structure of the executive, a power-sharing formula, and the composition of parliament. Joining us in studio now to give us an analysis of the South Sudan conflict is Ebrahim Deen from the Afro Middle East Centre, AMEC. Thanks for joining me, Ebrahim.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the international community through the UN has made a lot of efforts in terms of tabling ceasefire agreements. What is the stumbling block here?
The stumbling block is actually the implementation. So both parties, Mr. Masha and Mr. Kair's parties, in numerous rounds of agreements has agreed upon, unity government, transitional period. They've all agreed for ceasefires, but this has never been implemented. And the biggest issue is in this implementation is the fact that, the parties themselves, the interstate parties such as Uganda, such as Kenya, do have interest and have, especially in the case of Uganda, been backing certain groups in the conflict, and thus the partiality or the impartiality is questionable.
Now, we've just mentioned that leaders are gearing up for a fresh round of talks. Do you think these talks are going to bring peace this time around, considering that they've had a number of them over time?
I think the bigger issue in the South Sudanese is that aside from the IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development or Agency on Development, which is the regional bloc that deals with the Horn of Africa, the new talks do consist of South Africa, Kenya, and many various other states that aren't part of IGAD and that may be able to compel the two parties to actually implement the talks. But this will only be we can only see or actually have hope if we see some form of implementation, and we've actually been seeing in recent weeks that the conflict has actually been increasing in its veracity.
Now, you've mentioned the countries that aren't part of IGAD but will be part of the talks. What contribution do you think they're going to bring in practical terms this time around? I
think South Africa, for example, has various interests in South Sudan and also had played a very important role in the actual secession or the independence of South Sudan. So South Africa does have a very important role to play. Kenya, just likewise, and thus I think that they can actually, if pressure is put on the South Sudanese, call for or allow for or enable a situation where a solution can be found. I think, but the bigger issue in this is support for sanctions, and I think the lukewarm response on sanctions by many of these IGAD states and the other 5 mean that it's very unlikely that a solution, an implementation of a solution will be found.
Ebrahim, let's get a little controversial now. South Sudan government accuses the Sudanese government of supplying arms to the opposition rebels. Now, this report is saying that basically this flow of arms is fueling the conflict. What's your take on this? Do you think it's even true? It's
not really a controversial issue. It's widely known, common knowledge that the Sudanese do fund and have funded.
But why isn't it brought out within the talks?
It's similar to the fact that the Ugandans are funding Kair's regime, that the South Sudanese actually fund rebel groups within Khartoum. So it's something that has been going on in the region and in conflicts for a number of years, and that's why it's not something that is out of the ordinary. Sudan would like to see the conflict in South Sudan continue because it will mean that there'll be less pressure on the Sudanese regime. And Sudan also is against the Sudanese regime, the South Sudanese regime, because the South Sudanese regime has funded, and satellite images do show how it has funded the Sudanese Liberation Army North, the SPLM North, which is a rebel group operating in Kordofan and Blue Nile in Sudan itself. So both states are involved in funding rebel groups in each other's territories.
Now, going forward, what needs to be done to ensure that there's lasting peace in South Sudan?
The first issue needs to be an arms embargo and implementation, sanctions. There need to be implementation, at least the threat of sanctions, and this has not been there. So, for example, many in the South Sudanese regime and the rebel regime send, families are based abroad, send their kids abroad, and sanctions and targeted sanctions in this effect or to this effect can have a great impact. And at the end of the day, it needs to be one. We need to look at the short-term goal, which would be a unity government, but longer term, it needs to be an inclusive process. It needs to be a process where Sudanese or South Sudanese actually have a say in what's happening. And now, because of the wars, there's no capacity for South Sudanese to actually express their opposition, and that, and this is why the current conflict is happening.
Now, you've mentioned sanctions as one of the solutions. Why do you think it's taken so long for them to actually put them in place? What's holding it up?
The biggest issue, I think, in this regard was one, the South Sudan has been treated with a bit of kid gloves because we all had this hope that here's a new state, and give it some time to settle. And a key driver in this regard has been the U.S. So the U.S. has basically withstood pressure to put sanctions on the UN Security Council, charters and proposals for a number of for the past year at least, and now shows a more willingness to do so.
So willingness will hopefully get these peace talks going.
Yeah, I mean the big issue is implementation. It's very easy to come up with a comprehensive program, which has been happening over the past few IGATE talks. It's now monitoring implementation, and implementation has to be linked with some sticks. It can't just be a carrots approach.
Thank you so much, Ebrahim, for joining us. Unfortunately, we've run out of time.
Thanks for having me.
That was Ebrahim Deen, a researcher from the Afro Middle East Centre, AMEC, talking to us about the conflict in South Sudan.